What if the reason you feel stressed, emotionally exhausted, and constantly disappointed is because you're trying to control people who were never meant to be controlled? Most people spend their entire lives chasing approval, overthinking every interaction, and trying to stop others from leaving, judging, or misunderstanding them. But in the book The Let Them Theory, you will discover a surprisingly simple mindset that can instantly bring more peace, confidence, and emotional freedom into your life. In this audiobook summary, you'll learn how to stop caring so much about other people's opinions, how to let go of toxic expectations, and how to finally focus on yourself without guilt. If you've ever felt hurt by rejection, drained by relationships, or trapped in overthinking, this video is for you. And by the end of this audiobook, you may never look at people, relationships, or your own happiness the same way again. Introduction. Have you ever stayed awake at night replaying a conversation in your head, wondering if someone is upset with you? Or maybe you tried desperately to make someone like you understand you, respect you, or stay in your life, only to feel exhausted and disappointed in the end. The introduction of the Let Them Theory begins with a brutally honest truth. Most of our stress comes from trying to control people, situations, and outcomes that were never fully in our control to begin with. We spend an incredible amount of emotional energy trying to manage how others think, act, feel, or respond to us. And without realizing it, we slowly lose our peace. The book introduces a surprisingly simple but deeply powerful mindset shift. Let them. If people want to misunderstand you, let them. If they want to judge you, let them. If they want to leave, let them. At first, this idea may sound passive or even harsh, but the deeper message is actually about freedom. The author explains that constantly fighting reality is one of the biggest causes of anxiety, frustration, and emotional burnout. When you stop trying to force people to behave the way you want, you create space to focus on the only thing you truly can control, yourself. Think about a real-life example. Imagine you send a message to a friend, and hours pass without a reply. Immediately, your mind starts creating stories. Did I say something wrong? Are they ignoring me? Did I upset them? You may check your phone every few minutes, feel anxious, or even send another message just to fix the discomfort. But what if, instead of spiraling into overthinking, you simply said, let them respond when they want? In that moment, you stop giving away your emotional power. You stop making someone else's behavior responsible for your inner peace. The introduction also challenges the invisible pressure many people carry every day, the pressure to be liked by everyone. From childhood, many of us are conditioned to seek approval. We want teachers, parents, friends, co-workers, and even strangers to validate us. Social media makes this even worse. One negative comment or lack of likes can suddenly affect our mood for the entire day. The book argues that this constant need for validation traps people in emotional dependence. Instead of living authentically, they start performing for acceptance. They avoid saying what they truly think. They tolerate disrespect just to avoid conflict. They remain in unhealthy relationships because they fear being abandoned. The let them mindset breaks this cycle. It reminds you that other people's reactions are not always about you. Sometimes people are projecting their own insecurities, pain, jealousy, or limitations. Sometimes people leave because your path no longer aligns with theirs. Sometimes people judge you simply because your confidence makes them uncomfortable. And sometimes no amount of explaining, proving, or sacrificing will change how someone sees you. The introduction teaches that accepting this reality is not weakness. It is emotional maturity. Imagine a workplace scenario where you work incredibly hard on a project, but your boss still criticizes it unfairly. Most people would spend days feeling angry, trying to prove themselves, or replaying the criticism in their head. But the book asks a different question. What if you allowed people to have their opinions without letting those opinions define your worth? What if your confidence came from your own values instead of external approval? This doesn't mean becoming careless or arrogant. It means learning the difference between constructive feedback and emotional captivity. Another powerful idea introduced in this section is that trying to control others often damages relationships instead of improving them. For example, in romantic relationships, people sometimes try to change their partner's behavior out of fear. They monitor who they talk to, get upset when expectations are not met, or constantly seek reassurance. Over time, this creates tension and emotional exhaustion for both people. The book suggests that healthy relationships are built not on control, but on trust, acceptance, and boundaries. Let them does not mean allowing mistreatment. It means recognizing when forcing someone to change is destroying your peace more than helping the relationship. The introduction also encourages listeners to ask themselves difficult but life-changing questions. How much of your daily stress comes from worrying about things outside your control? How often do you silence yourself just to avoid being judged? Are you living your life based on your values or based on other people's opinions? What would change if you stopped chasing validation and started protecting your peace instead? One of the most inspiring aspects of the introduction is how practical the message is. This is not just philosophy, it is something you can apply immediately. The next time someone disagrees with your choices, instead of arguing endlessly, pause and think. Let them. The next time someone leaves your life, instead of begging them to stay, remind yourself that forcing connections only creates suffering. The next time you feel pressure to impress everyone around you, ask yourself whether you are sacrificing your authenticity for temporary approval. By the end of the introduction, the listener begins to realize something powerful. Freedom is not found in controlling everything around you. Freedom is found in letting go of the illusion that you ever could. The moment you stop trying to manage every opinion, every reaction, and every outcome, you reclaim energy, clarity, and emotional peace. And that simple shift can completely transform the way you experience life. Main points. Most emotional stress comes from trying to control people and situations outside your control. The core idea of the book is simple. Let them. Let people think what they want, act how they want, and make their own choices. Constantly seeking validation from others lead to anxiety, overthinking, and emotional exhaustion. Other people's opinions do not define your worth or identity. Trying to force people to change often damages relationships instead of improving them. Emotional freedom begins when you focus on controlling yourself instead of controlling others. Reflective question: how much peace could you gain if you stopped trying to control everyone around you? Actionable lessons. The next time someone disappoints you, pause before reacting and ask yourself whether the situation is truly within your control. Practice replacing overthinking with acceptance by saying, let them. Spend less energy chasing approval and more energy building self-respect. Set healthy boundaries instead of trying to force people to behave differently. Focus daily on your own actions, mindset, and emotional well-being instead of obsessing over others' opinions. What is the let them theory? At the heart of this book lies an idea so simple that many people dismiss it at first. Yet once understood deeply, it has the power to completely change the way you experience relationships, stress, rejection, and even your own identity. The let them theory is built around two words: let them. If people want to judge you, let them. If they want to misunderstand you, let them. If they want to leave your life, let them. If they want to doubt your dreams, criticize your decisions, or underestimate your potential, let them. The theory is not about giving up, becoming passive, or allowing disrespect. It is about recognizing a powerful truth. You cannot control other people, and the more you try, the more exhausted, anxious, and emotionally trapped you become. Most people spend years trying to manage how others see them. They constantly adjust their personality depending on who they are around. They over-explain themselves, seek approval, avoid conflict, and sacrifice their own peace just to keep others comfortable. The book argues that this behavior slowly disconnects people from their authentic selves. Instead of living freely, they become emotional prisoners of other people's opinions. The let them theory offers a way out of this prison. It teaches that true peace begins the moment you stop trying to force people to behave according to your expectations. Think about how often people suffer because reality does not match the picture they created in their minds. A friend stops replying as often as before, and suddenly anxiety appears. A partner changes their behavior, and fear takes over. A coworker acts cold, and you spend the entire day trying to figure out what went wrong. In many of these situations, people immediately enter control mode. They try to fix, convince, chase, or force connection. But the theory asks a completely different question. What if you simply let people show you who they are without trying to manipulate the outcome? Imagine a situation where someone you deeply care about starts drifting away emotionally. Most people react with panic. They may send long emotional messages, become clingy, overthink every interaction, or desperately try to hold a relationship together. But according to the let them theory, chasing someone who is already emotionally leaving only increases suffering. Instead, the healthier response may be to step back and let them make their own choices. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop abandoning yourself in the process of trying to keep someone else. The book explains that one of the biggest misconceptions people have is believing that love, friendship, or respect can be controlled through effort alone. But human beings are independent individuals with their own emotions, fears, priorities, and decisions. No amount of overthinking can force loyalty. No amount of explaining can guarantee understanding. And no amount of people-pleasing can guarantee acceptance. The theory encourages readers to stop wasting energy trying to earn what should be freely given. One of the most relatable examples discussing the spirit of this theory is social media. Imagine posting something online that you genuinely love, only to receive criticism or judgment from strangers. For many people, one negative comment can ruin their confidence. They begin deleting posts, doubting themselves, or trying to explain their intentions to everyone. But the let them theory suggests another path. Let people misunderstand you. Let them criticize. Let them have opinions. You do not need universal approval to live authentically. In fact, constantly seeking approval often destroys authenticity. Another powerful aspect of the theory is the understanding that people's behavior often reveals more about them than about you. For example, if someone constantly criticizes your ambitions, it may reflect their own fears and insecurities rather than your actual potential. If someone avoids supporting you when you grow, it may be because your progress reminds them of the risks they never took. The book encourages readers to stop internalizing every reaction they receive from others. Not every rejection is proof that you are unworthy. Sometimes rejection is simply redirection. The theory also applies strongly to family dynamics and friendships. Many people carry emotional burdens because they desperately want certain people to understand them. They replay arguments in their minds, searching for the perfect words that would finally make someone see their perspective. But sometimes understanding never comes. Some people are simply unwilling or unable to meet you emotionally. The let them theory teaches that peace often comes not from finally being understood, but from accepting that you do not need everyone's understanding to move forward. A hypothetical example makes this even clearer. Imagine a young man who wants to become an artist, but his family constantly pressures him to choose a safe career instead. Every conversation becomes an argument. He feels guilty for following his passion and anxious about disappointing others. Over time, he starts doubting himself. According to the theory, this person must eventually accept that he cannot fully control how his family reacts to his dreams. They may never completely approve, but if he sacrifices his purpose just to avoid criticism, he may spend his entire life feeling trapped. Let them disagree becomes an act of self-respect, not rebellion. The book also emphasizes an important second step that often gets overlooked. After let them comes let me. Let me focus on my own growth. Let me protect my peace. Let me choose relationships that feel healthy. Let me stop over-explaining myself. Let me build a life that aligns with my values instead of constantly performing for approval. This shift is incredibly powerful because it turns attention away from controlling others and back toward personal responsibility and emotional maturity. As listeners absorb this chapter, they are encouraged to reflect deeply on their own lives. How many decisions have you made out of fear of being judged? How much energy do you spend trying to manage other people's opinions? Are there relationships in your life where you are constantly sacrificing your peace just to avoid rejection? What would happen if you stopped chasing acceptance and started accepting yourself first? The beauty of the let them theory is that it does not promise a life without pain, criticism, or loss. Instead, it offers something more realistic and more valuable: emotional freedom. You stop fighting reality. You stop trying to control every outcome. You stop shrinking yourself for people who were never meant to fully understand your path. And in that process, you gain something many people spend their entire lives searching for: peace within yourself. Main points. The let them theory teaches that trying to control people and outcomes create emotional suffering. Let them means allowing people to think, act, and choose freely without losing your inner peace. Seeking constant approval disconnects people from their authentic selves. Other people's reactions often reflect their own insecurities, fears, and perspectives. Chasing people, forcing understanding, or begging for acceptance usually increases emotional pain. Emotional freedom comes from focusing on your own actions, boundaries, and mindset instead of controlling others. The second step after let them is letting yourself grow, heal, and live authentically. Reflective questions. Are you living according to your values or according to other people's expectations? Which relationship in your life causes the most stress because you are trying to control the outcome? What would change if you stopped needing everyone's approval? In what areas of your life do you need to say, let them? Actionable lessons. The next time someone criticizes or misunderstands you, resist the urge to over-explain yourself immediately. Practice emotional detachment from situations you cannot control. Focus more energy on improving yourself instead of managing others' opinions. Observe people's actions instead of constantly trying to change them. Remind yourself daily that peace comes from acceptance, not control. Why we care too much about others. One of the most uncomfortable truths explored in the let them theory is that many people are not truly living for themselves. Instead, they are living in reaction to other people's opinions, expectations, judgments, and approval. They wake up worrying about how they are perceived. They change their behavior depending on who is around them. They replay conversations in their head, overanalyze text messages, and constantly wonder whether people like them, respect them, or secretly dislike them. The chapter Why We Care Too Much About Others exposes how deeply this pattern controls modern life and how much emotional energy people lose because of it. The book explains that human beings are naturally wired to care about social acceptance. Thousands of years ago, being rejected by a tribe could mean isolation and death. So the brain evolved to fear exclusion. Even though society has changed, the emotional system inside people still reacts strongly to judgment and rejection. That is why a single negative comment online can hurt more than 10 compliments. That is why someone can spend an entire day thinking about one awkward interaction while completely ignoring all the positive moments around them. The brain treats social rejection like danger, even when there is no real threat. But the problem becomes dangerous when this natural desire for connection turns into emotional dependence. Many people no longer just appreciate approval. They need it to feel worthy. Their confidence rises and falls based on how others react to them. If someone praises them, they feel valuable. If someone criticizes them, they feel broken. The book argues that this creates an exhausting cycle where people hand over control of their emotional state to everyone around them. Imagine a student who posts a photo online after finally feeling confident about themselves. For a few minutes, they feel happy, but then they start checking how many likes they received. If the response is lower than expected, insecurity begins to appear. Suddenly, the happiness disappears, replaced by self-doubt. They may begin comparing themselves to others, questioning their appearance, or wondering why they are not enough. In reality, nothing about them changed in those few hours. The only thing that changed was the validation they received from others. This is how powerful external approval can become when someone's self-worth depends on it. The chapter also explores how childhood experiences shape this behavior. Many people grow up learning that love and approval are conditional. Maybe they were praised only when they achieved something impressive. Maybe they were criticized heavily for mistakes. Maybe they learned to avoid conflict by becoming people pleasers. Over time, they developed the belief that being accepted requires constant performance. As adults, this mindset follows them everywhere. They struggle to say no, avoid disappointing people, and feel guilty whenever someone is upset with them. Consider a workplace example. Imagine an employee who always says yes to extra work, even when they are exhausted. They stay late, sacrifice their personal time, and avoid expressing disagreement because they fear being seen as difficult or lazy. At first, others may appreciate their effort, but eventually the employee becomes emotionally drained and resentful. Yet they continue because deep down, they believe their worth depends on being useful and liked. The book explains that this is not kindness, it is fear disguised as responsibility. One of the most relatable parts of this chapter is how it describes overthinking. Caring too much about others often leads people into mental loops that never end. Someone gives a short reply, and suddenly the mind creates endless stories. Did I annoy them? Are they angry? Did I embarrass myself? Hours or even days can be wasted analyzing situations that the other person may not even remember. The book highlights how much suffering is created not by reality itself, but by the meaning people attach to it. A powerful hypothetical scenario in this chapter involves a young woman who dreams of starting her own business. She has ideas, passion, and ambition, but she never begins because she is terrified of what people might say if she fails. She imagines relatives judging her, friends laughing at her, and strangers criticizing her online. So instead of risking judgment, she stays in a life that feels safe but unfulfilling. Years later, she realizes something painful. The fear of other people's opinions stole opportunities she can never get back. The tragedy is not failure. The tragedy is allowing fear of judgment to prevent authentic living. The book repeatedly emphasizes that people who care too much about others often abandon themselves without realizing it. They silence their opinions to avoid conflict. They tolerate disrespect to avoid rejection. They stay in toxic relationships because they fear loneliness more than unhappiness. They constantly shapeshift into whatever version of themselves will be most accepted in a particular room. Eventually, they lose touch with who they really are. One of the strongest messages in this section is that people's opinions are often unstable and contradictory anyway. One person may criticize you for being too quiet, while another criticizes you for talking too much. One person may judge you for taking risks, while another judges you for playing safe. If you spend your entire life trying to satisfy everyone, you will eventually become exhausted because it is impossible. The book argues that freedom begins when you stop making universal approval your goal. The chapter also challenges listeners to notice how much of their stress comes from imagined judgment rather than actual judgment. Many people walk into social situations assuming everyone is analyzing them, when in reality most people are too busy worrying about themselves. The fear of being judged often becomes larger than judgment itself. This realization can be incredibly liberating because it reminds people that much of the pressure they feel exists inside their own mind. The let them theory offers a different path. Instead of constantly trying to manage how others perceive you, allow people to have their opinions. Let them misunderstand you. Let them disagree. Let them think whatever they want. The moment you stop treating other people's approval as a requirement for self-worth, you begin reclaiming your emotional freedom. The chapter encourages deep self-reflection. How many decisions in your life were influenced by fear of judgment? How often do you say yes when you actually want to say no? Are you living according to your own values, or according to what feels safest socially? What dreams, boundaries, or truths have you sacrificed just to stay accepted? One of the most practical lessons from this chapter is learning to pause before reacting emotionally to other people's opinions. Instead of immediately defending yourself or trying to gain approval, ask yourself, does this person's opinion truly define me? Most of the time, the answer is no. Confidence is not built by controlling what others think. It is built by remaining connected to yourself even when others disapprove. By the end of this chapter, the listener begins to understand something life-changing. Caring about people is healthy, but needing their approval to feel worthy is emotionally dangerous. The more you depend on external validation, the more power you give away. But when you learn to validate yourself, set boundaries, and live authentically, you stop becoming a prisoner of other people's opinions. And that is where true freedom begins. Main points. Humans naturally care about social acceptance because of deep psychological and evolutionary reasons. The problem begins when approval becomes necessary for self-worth. People often overthink situations and create unnecessary emotional suffering. Childhood experiences can train people to become approval seekers and people pleasers. Fear of judgment prevents many people from taking risks and living authentically. Trying to satisfy everyone is impossible and emotionally exhausting. Emotional freedom comes from accepting that not everyone will approve of you. Reflective questions. How much of your daily stress comes from worrying about what others think? Have you ever abandoned your true feelings just to avoid rejection or criticism? What decisions in your life were influenced more by fear than by genuine desire? If you stopped needing approval from everyone, what would you finally allow yourself to do? Actionable lessons. Notice moments when you automatically seek validation before trusting your own judgment. Practice saying no without over-explaining yourself. Stop replaying conversations and remind yourself that not every interaction defines your worth. Take one action this week based on your own values instead of other people's expectations. Build self-respect internally instead of depending on praise from others. Stop trying to control people. One of the biggest sources of emotional exhaustion in life comes from a habit most people don't even realize they have. Try and control other people. In this chapter of the Let Them theory, the author explains that many people spend enormous amounts of energy attempting to manage how others behave, think, feel, respond, or treat them. They try to control relationships, conversations, outcomes, emotions, and even the opinions people have about them. And while it may feel like they are protecting themselves or fixing situations, the reality is often the opposite. The more someone tries to control people, the more anxious, frustrated, and emotionally drained they become. The difficult truth presented in this chapter is simple but powerful. You cannot control another human being. You can influence, communicate, support, or guide, but you cannot force someone to change, care, understand, love, stay, or behave exactly the way you want. Every person has their own thoughts, experiences, insecurities, desires, and free will. Yet many people resist this reality because accepting it feels uncomfortable. They would rather believe that if they just explain themselves better, try harder, sacrifice more, or worry enough, they can eventually control the outcome. But this mindset traps them in constant emotional tension. Think about how common this is in everyday life. Imagine a parent who desperately wants their adult child to make better decisions. The parent constantly gives advice, criticizes choices, checks in repeatedly, and tries to direct the child's life out of fear and concern. But instead of improving the relationship, this often creates distance and resentment. The child feels controlled, while the parent feels ignored and frustrated. Both suffer because one person is trying to force change instead of accepting that every individual must ultimately make their own choices and learn their own lessons. The same pattern appears in friendships and romantic relationships. Imagine someone whose partner suddenly becomes emotionally distant. Instead of calmly observing the situation, they panic internally. They begin overanalyzing every message, asking for reassurance constantly, checking social media activity, or trying to control the relationship through emotional pressure. But the harder they try to hold on, the more tension enters a relationship. The chapter explains that fear often disguises itself as control. People try to control others because they are afraid of loss, rejection, betrayal, uncertainty, or feeling powerless. One of the most powerful ideas in this section is that trying to control people often destroys peace more than the original problem itself. The emotional suffering does not only come from someone else's behavior, it comes from resisting reality. For example, imagine having a coworker who is lazy and unreliable. You may spend every day complaining about them, trying to change them, arguing with them, or becoming angry about their behavior. But no amount of frustration may actually transform that person. Eventually, your mental energy becomes consumed by something outside your control. The chapter asks a life-changing question. What if instead of obsessing over changing people, you focus on controlling your own response? The let them theory introduces a mindset that feels uncomfortable at first because it requires surrendering the illusion of control. If someone wants to act irresponsibly, let them. If someone wants to misunderstand you, let them. If someone refuses to grow, let them. This does not mean approving of harmful behavior or refusing to set boundaries. It means recognizing the difference between healthy influence and emotional obsession. You can communicate your needs clearly, but you cannot force another person to become who you want them to be. A particularly relatable example in this chapter involves social situations. Imagine attending a gathering where someone seemed cold or uninterested in talking to you. Many people immediately begin trying to fix the interaction. They become overly friendly, force conversations, seek validation, or spend the rest of the night wondering what went wrong. But what if the other person is simply distracted, tired, or dealing with their own issues? The chapter teaches that not every uncomfortable interaction requires control, analysis, or correction. Sometimes peace comes from allowing people to be exactly who they are without making their behavior your emotional responsibility. The book also explains how controlling behavior can appear in subtle forms. Some people try to control others through guilt. Others use constant advice-giving, emotional reactions, silent treatment, or people-pleasing to influence outcomes. For example, someone may constantly sacrifice their own needs in hopes that others will appreciate them more or stay loyal to them. But hidden underneath this behavior is often an attempt to control how others feel. The painful reality is that no amount of sacrifice guarantees love, loyalty, or understanding. One hypothetical scenario in the chapter perfectly illustrates this. Imagine a young woman whose best friend begins spending more time with new people. Instead of accepting the natural change in the friendship, she becomes consumed with fear of being replaced. She texts constantly, becomes emotionally reactive, and tries to regain control of the connection. But her desperation pushes the friendship further away. Eventually, she realizes something painful. Her fear of losing the friendship created the very tension that damaged it. The chapter teaches that clinging tightly to people often comes from insecurity, not love. Another major lesson in this section is understanding the emotional cost of trying to manage other people's opinions. Many people spend years shaping their lives around external approval. They avoid speaking honestly, hide parts of themselves, or constantly explain their choices just to prevent judgment. But the book argues that this is another form of control. People are trying to control how they are perceived because they believe acceptance will protect them emotionally. Yet no matter how carefully someone behaves, criticism is unavoidable. Some people will misunderstand you no matter how clearly you explain yourself. The chapter repeatedly reminds listeners that acceptance is not weakness. In fact, acceptance requires enormous emotional maturity. It means accepting that people may disagree with you. People may leave you. People may fail to meet your expectations. People may not support your dreams. And despite all of this, you are still capable of protecting your peace and moving forward. Acceptance frees people from the exhausting cycle of trying to force reality into a shape that feels comfortable. The practical application of this chapter is incredibly powerful. The next time someone behaves in a way you dislike, pause before trying to change them immediately. Ask yourself, is this truly within my control? If the answer is no, focus your energy on your own boundaries, reactions, and choices instead. For example, if someone repeatedly disrespects you, you cannot force them to become respectful, but you can decide how much access they have to your life. That shift changes everything because it moves attention away from controlling others and back toward personal responsibility. The chapter also encourages listeners to reflect on difficult questions. Who are you constantly trying to change in your life? How much energy do you waste trying to manage situations outside your control? Are you confusing control with love, care, or responsibility? What would happen if you finally accepted people as they are instead of exhausting yourself trying to turn them into who you want them to be? By the end of this chapter, the message becomes deeply clear. Trying to control people is one of the fastest ways to lose peace. The more tightly you try to hold on to outcomes, relationships, and other people's behavior, the more anxious life becomes. But when you let go of the illusion of control, you create space for emotional freedom, healthier boundaries, and deeper self-respect. Real peace begins when you stop trying to control everyone around you and start mastering your own mind instead. Main points. Trying to control other people creates emotional exhaustion and anxiety. You cannot force people to change, understand, love, or behave differently. Fear of rejection, uncertainty, and loss often drive controlling behavior. Trying to manage people's opinions and reactions leads to constant stress. Acceptance is not weakness, it is emotional maturity. Healthy relationships are built on boundaries and respect, not control. Peace comes from focusing on your own actions and responses instead of controlling others. Reflective questions. Who in your life are you constantly trying to change or control? How much stress comes from resisting reality instead of accepting it? Are you trying to control people out of love, fear, insecurity, or the need for certainty? What would your life feel like if you stopped chasing control and focus on inner peace instead? Actionable lessons. The next time someone disappoints you, pause and separate what you can control from what you cannot. Stop over-explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Practice acceptance by allowing people to reveal who they truly are. Set boundaries instead of trying to force people to change. Redirect your energy toward your own growth, emotional stability, and peace of mind. Let them judge you. One of the deepest fears most people carry is a fear of being judged. It influences the clothes they wear, the words they speak, the dreams they pursue, the photos they post, and even the version of themselves they show to the world. In this chapter of the Let Them theory, the author confronts a painful but liberating truth. No matter what you do, people will judge you anyway. You can be kind, hardworking, honest, talented, and respectful, and someone will still misunderstand you, criticize you, or dislike you. The problem is not that judgment exists. The problem is that many people spend their entire lives trying to avoid it, and in doing so, they slowly lose themselves. The chapter begins by explaining how much human behavior is secretly controlled by the desire to avoid criticism. Many people are not making decisions based on what they truly want. They are making decisions based on what feels socially safe. They silence their opinions to avoid conflict. They stay in careers they hate because they fear disappointing others. They avoid taking risks because they are terrified of looking foolish if they fail. They constantly edit their personality depending on the people around them, hoping to gain acceptance and avoid rejection. Over time, this creates a life that may look acceptable from the outside but feels deeply unfulfilling internally. Imagine a young man who dreams of becoming a musician. He spends years practicing privately, writing songs, and imagining himself performing on stage. But every time he thinks about sharing his work publicly, fear takes over. He imagines people laughing at him, relatives calling it unrealistic, and strangers criticizing his talent online. So he stays silent. Years pass, and the dream slowly fades, not because he lacked ability, but because he feared judgment more than he valued authenticity. The chapter argues that this silent surrender happens every day in countless lives. People abandon parts of themselves simply to stay emotionally safe. The let them theory introduces a radical shift in perspective. Instead of spending your life trying to avoid judgment, accept it. Let people judge you. Let them misunderstand your intentions. Let them think you are too ambitious, too emotional, too quiet, too different, or too unrealistic. Their opinions are not your identity. The moment you stop making approval your primary goal, you begin reclaiming your freedom. One of the most powerful lessons in this chapter is a realization that judgment is unavoidable because people see the world through their own experiences, insecurities, beliefs, and limitations. Two people can witness the exact same action and interpret it completely differently. One person may see confidence while another sees arrogance. One person may admire your ambition while another criticizes you for being selfish. This means trying to control everyone's perception of you is an impossible task. Yet millions of people exhaust themselves attempting exactly that. A relatable real-life example appears in social media culture. Someone posts a video expressing an honest opinion or showcasing their creativity. Within minutes, there are supportive comments, but also criticism and negativity. One stranger calls them inspiring while another calls them embarrassing. Many people become emotionally trapped by this. They obsess over the negative comments, replay criticism in their minds, and start doubting themselves. But the chapter teaches that criticism often says more about the person giving it than the person receiving it. People project their own fears, insecurities, frustrations, and biases onto others constantly. The book also explores how fear of judgment creates perfectionism. Many people never start projects, businesses, relationships, or creative pursuits because they want everything to be perfect before anyone sees it. But perfectionism is often just fear wearing a socially acceptable mask. A person says, "I'm waiting until I'm ready," when the deeper truth is, "I'm afraid of being judged if I'm not perfect." The tragedy is that waiting for perfect confidence usually means waiting forever. Think about how many opportunities disappear because of imagined judgment. Someone wants to go to the gym but fears being looked at. Someone wants to speak up in a meeting but fears sounding unintelligent. Someone wants to leave a toxic relationship but fears what family members might say. Someone wants to dress differently, start a channel, pursue art, change careers, or express emotions honestly, but they remain trapped because they prioritize external approval over internal truth. The chapter repeatedly asks listeners to consider a difficult question: how much of your life belongs to you, and how much belongs to other people's opinions? Another powerful point in this section is that people's judgments are often temporary and inconsistent. The same crowd that criticizes someone today may admire them tomorrow. History is filled with examples of individuals who were mocked, doubted, or rejected before becoming successful. Artists, entrepreneurs, writers, athletes, and innovators often face criticism long before receiving recognition. The chapter explains that if someone's self-worth depends entirely on external validation, they will constantly be emotionally unstable because public opinion changes endlessly. The author also shares the emotional cost of constantly trying to manage perception. People become mentally exhausted from overthinking every action. They replay conversations after social events, wondering if they sounded awkward. They hide their true personalities in fear of rejection. They become addicted to approval because every compliment temporarily relieves insecurity. But the relief never lasts. Soon they need more validation again. This creates an endless cycle where confidence becomes dependent on the unpredictable reactions of others. The let them theory offers a healthier path. Instead of obsessing over how everyone sees you, focus on whether you respect yourself. Instead of asking, "What will people think?" Ask, am I being true to myself? This shift changes everything because it moves the source of confidence from external approval to internal alignment. Confidence is not the absence of judgment. Confidence is the ability to continue being yourself despite judgment. A hypothetical scenario in the chapter captures this perfectly. Imagine a woman who decides to leave a stable corporate job to start a small business she genuinely cares about. Immediately, people around her begin giving opinions. Some say she is irresponsible. Others say she is unrealistic. Family members warn her about failure. Friends quietly doubt her decision. If she allows every opinion to control her choices, she may abandon the dream entirely. But if she accepts that judgment is part of any meaningful path, she becomes emotionally free enough to pursue what truly matters to her. The chapter also teaches listeners to separate constructive feedback from destructive judgment. Not all criticism is harmful. Some feedback can help people grow. But there's a major difference between useful guidance and opinions designed to shame, control, or discourage. Emotional maturity means learning which voices deserve attention and which ones should simply be allowed to exist without emotional attachment. As listeners move through this chapter, they are encouraged to ask themselves powerful reflective questions. What dreams have you delayed because of fear of judgment? How often do you change your behavior just to avoid criticism? Whose approval are you still chasing? What would your life look like if you stopped treating judgment like danger? The practical lessons in this chapter are deeply transformative. The next time you feel afraid of being judged, remind yourself that judgment is inevitable. No matter what you choose, someone will approve and someone will criticize. The goal is not to avoid judgment. The goal is to stop abandoning yourself because of it. Speak honestly. Pursue meaningful goals. Express your personality. Set boundaries. Accept that not everyone will understand you, and realize that they do not have to. By the end of this section, the listener understands a liberating truth. The fear of judgment is often far more limiting than judgment itself. Most people are not trapped by other people's opinions. They are trapped by the power they give those opinions. The moment you stop organizing your life around avoiding criticism, you begin living with authenticity, courage, and emotional freedom. And that is where real confidence begins. Main points. Fear of judgment controls many people's decisions, behavior, and identity. No matter what you do, some people will always criticize or misunderstand you. Trying to avoid judgment often leads people to abandon their authentic selves. People's opinions are shaped by their own insecurities, beliefs, and experiences. Perfectionism is often fear of judgment disguised as preparation. Confidence comes from self-respect, not universal approval. Emotional freedom begins when you stop making other people's opinions your identity. Reflective questions. What would you do differently if you were no longer afraid of being judged? How many of your decisions are influenced by the desire for approval? Are you living authentically or performing for acceptance? Which opinions in your life currently hold too much power over your confidence? Actionable lessons. Practice expressing your honest opinions without over-explaining yourself. Take one meaningful action this week despite fear of criticism. Stop seeking universal approval because it is impossible to achieve. Learn to separate useful feedback from emotional harmful judgment. Remind yourself daily that other people's opinions do not define your worth or potential. Let them leave. Few things hurt more deeply than feeling someone slowly pull away from your life. Whether it is a friend becoming distant, a romantic partner losing interest, a family member drifting emotionally, or even co-workers and social circles changing over time, human beings naturally fear abandonment and loss. In the chapter Let Them Leave, the let them theory addresses one of the most painful emotional struggles people face, the desperate attempt to hold on to people who no longer want to stay. The author explains that many people destroy their peace trying to prevent endings that were already happening. They chase, beg, over-explain, sacrifice themselves, and emotionally exhaust themselves trying to keep connections alive, even when those relationships are no longer healthy, mutual, or genuine. The chapter begins with a difficult but freeing truth. Not everyone who enters your life is meant to stay forever. Some people are temporary. Some relationships only exist for a season of your life. Others slowly fade because people grow in different directions. Yet many people resist this reality because they believe losing someone automatically means they failed, were not good enough, or were somehow unworthy of love. The book challenges this belief directly. Sometimes people leave not because you are unworthy, but because life changes, priorities shift, emotional compatibility disappears, or people simply become different versions of themselves. Imagine a situation where you are very close to a friend for years. You talk every day, share personal struggles, and believe the friendship will always remain the same. But gradually the dynamic changes. They stop reaching out as often. Conversations become shorter. Plans are canceled more frequently. Instead of accepting the change, you become consumed with anxiety. You send longer messages, overthink every interaction, and try harder and harder to recreate the old connection. Eventually, the friendship feels exhausting rather than natural. The chapter explains that many people suffer not because a relationship changed, but because they refuse to accept that it changed. One of the most powerful lessons in this chapter is the understanding that forcing people to stay rarely creates genuine connection. If someone has emotionally checked out, no amount of convincing, guilt, pressure, or self-sacrifice can truly rebuild authentic closeness. In fact, trying to hold on to people too tightly often pushes them further away. Fear of loss can create controlling behavior, emotional dependence, and desperation, all of which damage relationships even more. The let them theory introduces a painful but transformative mindset shift. If someone wants to leave, let them. If someone no longer values a relationship, let them reveal that through their actions. If someone chooses distance, let them make that choice. This does not mean pretending the pain does not exist. It does not mean becoming emotionally cold or acting like relationships do not matter. It means accepting reality instead of fighting it endlessly. The chapter also highlights how many people confuse attachment with love. Real love cannot be forced. Healthy relationships involve mutual effort, mutual respect, and genuine desire from both sides. But when one person is constantly chasing while the other is constantly pulling away, the relationship becomes emotionally unbalanced. The book explains that many people stay trapped in unhealthy dynamics because they fear loneliness more than unhappiness. They would rather fight endlessly to keep someone than face the discomfort of letting go. A relatable hypothetical example in the chapter involves a woman in a long-term relationship where her partner has become emotionally unavailable. He rarely communicates, avoids important conversations, and no longer invests energy into the relationship. Yet she continues trying to fix everything herself. She blames herself for every problem, constantly adjusts her behavior, and becomes emotionally drained trying to bring back the connection. Deep down, she knows the relationship no longer feels healthy, but she fears being alone and believes that letting go means failure. The chapter teaches that sometimes holding on causes far more suffering than releasing what is already leaving. The book also discusses how people often romanticize the past instead of accepting the present. They hold on to memories of how someone used to treat them and ignore how that person behaves now. For example, someone may remain emotionally attached to a friendship because of shared history, even though the current relationship feels one-sided and emotionally draining. The chapter encourages listeners to stop falling in love with potential, memories, or old versions of people while ignoring reality. One of the most emotionally powerful ideas in this section is that rejection and loss often redirect people toward healthier paths. At first, being left behind can feel devastating. Someone may believe their world is collapsing because a relationship ended or connection faded. But later, they often realize that losing certain people created space for growth, healing, new relationships, and deeper self-respect. The chapter explains that some endings protect people from futures that would have continued hurting them. Think about how many people remain stuck because they refuse to release what no longer belongs in their life. Some continue chasing unavailable partners for years. Others stay loyal to friendships built only on history, not mutual care. Some constantly seek closure from people unwilling to provide it. The emotional energy spent trying to force unwilling people to stay often prevents individuals from building healthier, more fulfilling lives. The let them theory teaches that one of the highest forms of self-respect is allowing people to make their own choices without abandoning yourself in the process. If someone consistently shows disinterest, dishonesty, disrespect, or emotional distance, their behavior is information. Instead of desperately trying to change their mind, the healthier response may be acceptance. Let them reveal who they are. Let them walk away if they choose to. Let them miss the opportunity to have access to your energy, loyalty, and care. Another important point in this chapter is understanding that endings are not always dramatic. Sometimes people simply outgrow each other. Priorities shift. Life paths separate. Emotional needs evolve. The chapter encourages listeners not to interpret every ending as personal failure. Relationships can end even when nobody is completely wrong. Accepting this truth helps people let go with less bitterness and more emotional maturity. The practical application of this chapter is incredibly powerful. The next time you notice yourself chasing someone's attention, affection, or validation, pause and ask yourself a difficult question. Why am I trying so hard to keep someone who is showing me they no longer want the same connection? That moment of honesty can reveal whether the relationship is rooted in mutual care or fear of abandonment. The chapter also invites deep reflection. Are there relationships in your life where you are doing all the emotional work? Are you holding on to someone because you genuinely love them, or because you feel loneliness and rejection? How much of your energy is being wasted trying to prevent an ending that may already be happening? What would happen if you trusted that losing the wrong people creates space for the right ones? One of the most healing lessons in this chapter is realizing that your worth is not measured by who stays. People leave for countless reasons, many of which have nothing to do with your value as a person. Someone's inability to love you properly does not mean you are unlovable. Someone drifting away does not erase your importance. And someone choosing distance does not mean you should destroy yourself trying to close the gap. By the end of this chapter, the listener begins to understand something deeply liberating. Peace often begins where chasing ends. The more tightly people cling to those who no longer want to stay, the more suffering they create for themselves. But when they accept reality, respect themselves enough to stop forcing connection, and trust that life will continue moving forward, they reclaim emotional freedom. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is stop trying to hold on and simply let them leave. Main points. Not everyone who enters your life is meant to stay forever. Trying to force people to stay often creates emotional exhaustion and unhealthy attachment. Relationships should involve mutual effort, respect, and genuine connection. Fear of loneliness causes many people to hold on to unhealthy relationships. Accepting endings is emotionally healthier than constantly resisting reality. Someone leaving does not define your worth or value as a person. Letting go creates space for growth, healing, and healthier relationships. Reflective questions. Are you chasing someone who is already emotionally checked out of the relationship? Do you feel loneliness more than unhappiness? Are you holding on to memories instead of accepting present reality? What relationships in your life feel one-sided and emotionally draining? What would happen if you stopped trying to force connection and allowed people to make their own choices? Actionable lessons. Pay attention to people's actions instead of only listening to their words. Stop over-investing in relationships where effort is not mutual. Practice accepting emotional distance instead of immediately chasing reassurance. Focus on building self-respect instead of forcing people to stay. Remind yourself that losing someone does not reduce your worth or future potential. The power of emotional freedom. One of the most life-changing ideas in the Let Them theory is the concept of emotional freedom. Most people spend years believing freedom means having more money, more success, better relationships, or a perfect life with no problems. But this chapter reveals a deeper truth. Real freedom begins when your emotional state is no longer controlled by everyone around you. Emotional freedom means you stop allowing other people's opinions, actions, moods, judgments, and decisions to control your inner peace. It means you no longer wake up feeling emotionally trapped by whether someone texted you back, approved of you, praised you, rejected you, or understood you. Instead, your sense of peace begins to come from within. The chapter starts by exposing how emotionally dependent many people unknowingly become. They hand over their happiness to strangers on social media, family members, romantic partners, co-workers, and friends. A compliment makes them feel valuable, while criticism makes them feel worthless. A loving message makes them feel secure, while silence creates panic. Their emotions constantly rise and fall depending on how others behave. Over time, this creates a life filled with emotional instability because external validation and external circumstances are always changing. Imagine a man who starts every morning by checking his phone. If his partner replied warmly, he feels relaxed and confident for the rest of the day. But if a message feels cold or distant, his mood instantly changes. He becomes anxious, distracted, and emotionally unsettled. His entire emotional state depends on another person's behavior. The chapter explains that this is one of the clearest signs of emotional captivity. The problem is not caring about relationships. The problem is losing control over your emotional balance because of them. The let them theory teaches that emotional freedom begins the moment you stop trying to control everything outside yourself. Most people suffer because they constantly resist reality. They want people to behave differently, think differently, love differently, and choose differently. When reality does not match their expectations, frustration takes over. But emotional freedom requires accepting a difficult truth. People will do what they want to do. Some will disappoint you. Some will misunderstand you. Some will leave. Some will criticize you. And no amount of overthinking or emotional pressure can completely prevent that. This realization may initially sound depressing, but the chapter presents it as deeply liberating. Once you accept that you cannot control everyone around you, you stop wasting energy fighting reality. Instead of obsessing over changing others, you begin focusing on your own mindset, boundaries, choices, and emotional responses. That shift changes everything because it returns power back to you. A relatable real-life example appears in workplace situations. Imagine an employee who constantly seeks approval from their boss. Every piece of feedback becomes emotionally overwhelming. If the boss seems disappointed, the employee spends the entire evening anxious and self-critical. They overwork themselves trying to gain validation, believing their worth depends on external praise. But eventually, they become emotionally exhausted because approval never feels permanent. The chapter explains that emotional freedom comes when a person can accept feedback without attaching their entire identity to it. They stop measuring their worth through other people's reactions. The book also explores how emotional freedom changes relationships. Many people enter relationships carrying fear, insecurity, and emotional dependence. They constantly seek reassurance because they are terrified of abandonment. They monitor behavior, overanalyze messages, and panic when attention changes. But emotionally free people approach relationships differently. They still love deeply, but they do not abandon themselves in the process. They understand that another person's choices are outside their control, and because of this, they stop living in constant fear. A hypothetical example in this chapter illustrates this beautifully. Imagine two people in similar situations. Both experience criticism from friends after making an unusual career decision. The first person becomes emotionally crushed. They constantly defend themselves, seek approval, and lose confidence because of the criticism. The second person listens respectfully but remains emotionally grounded. They understand that disagreement is normal and that not everyone will support their choices. Both individuals face the same external situation, but their internal responses are completely different. The difference is emotional freedom. One of the most important lessons in this chapter is understanding that emotional freedom is not emotional numbness. The goal is not to stop feeling emotions or pretending pain does not exist. Emotionally free people still feel sadness, disappointment, rejection, and grief. The difference is that they do not become emotionally controlled by every external event. They experience emotions without allowing those emotions to completely dominate their identity or decision-making. The chapter also challenges the idea that emotional control comes from controlling circumstances. Many people believe they will finally feel peaceful once everyone understands them, once no one criticizes them, once relationships become perfect, or once life becomes predictable. But the book argues that this mindset creates endless suffering because life will never remain perfectly stable. Emotional freedom comes from becoming internally stable even when external situations remain uncertain. The author explains that emotional attachment to approval is one of the biggest obstacles to freedom. For example, some people avoid expressing their true opinions because they fear upsetting others. They hide their personality to stay accepted. They tolerate disrespect because they fear losing connection. Over time, this creates emotional exhaustion because they are constantly performing instead of living authentically. Emotional freedom means accepting that authenticity may lead some people to dislike you, misunderstand you, or leave, and being emotionally okay with that reality. The chapter introduces another powerful idea. Boundaries are a form of emotional freedom. Many people believe boundaries are selfish because they are conditioned to prioritize everyone else's comfort above their own well-being. But emotionally free people understand that protecting their peace is necessary. They no longer feel obligated to explain every decision, tolerate constant disrespect, or sacrifice themselves to maintain relationships. They stop trying to rescue everyone emotionally and begin taking responsibility for their own mental health. Consider a scenario where someone has a toxic friend who constantly drains their energy with negativity, criticism, or manipulation. Many people continue tolerating this because they fear conflict or guilt. But emotional freedom means recognizing that protecting your peace is not cruelty. Sometimes freedom comes from stepping away from relationships that repeatedly damage your emotional well-being. The practical lessons in this chapter are deeply transformative because they can be applied immediately. The next time someone disappoints you, instead of spiraling emotionally, pause and ask yourself, am I trying to control something outside my control? The next time you feel desperate for approval, ask yourself whether your self-worth has become dependent on external validation. The next time criticism affects your confidence, remind yourself that another person's opinion is not your identity. The chapter also encourages listeners to reflect honestly on their emotional habits. How much of your mood depends on other people's behavior? Do you constantly seek reassurance to feel secure? Are you emotionally exhausted because you are trying to control everything around you? What would your life feel like if your peace no longer disappeared every time someone disappointed you? One of the most inspiring messages in this chapter is that emotional freedom creates a completely different experience of life. You stop living in constant reaction mode. You stop obsessing over people's opinions. You stop chasing validation. You stop fearing rejection as if it destroys your worth. Instead, you begin trusting yourself more deeply. You become calmer, more confident, and more emotionally stable because your peace no longer depends entirely on external circumstances. By the end of this chapter, the listener realizes that emotional freedom is one of the greatest forms of power a person can develop. Not power over others, but power over themselves. The ability to remain grounded in a world full of uncertainty, criticism, rejection, and change is incredibly rare. And the moment you stop giving everyone else control over your emotional state, you begin experiencing a level of peace, clarity, and self-respect that many people spend their entire lives searching for. Main points. Emotional freedom means your peace no longer depends entirely on other people's actions or opinions. Many people unknowingly become emotionally dependent on validation and approval. Trying to control external situations creates emotional exhaustion. Emotionally free people accept reality instead of constantly resisting it. Emotional freedom is not emotional numbness. It is emotional stability. Boundaries are an essential part of protecting emotional well-being. True peace comes from internal stability, not external perfection. Reflective questions. How much of your happiness depends on other people's behavior toward you? Do you constantly seek reassurance to feel emotionally secure? What situations cause you to lose emotional balance most easily? Are you sacrificing authenticity in order to gain approval? What would your life feel like if your peace came from within instead of external validation? Actionable lessons. Practice separating your self-worth from other people's opinions. Pause before reacting emotionally to situations outside your control. Set healthy boundaries with people who repeatedly drain your energy. Focus on controlling your responses instead of controlling others. Remind yourself daily that emotional stability comes from self-trust, not universal approval. How to apply the theory in daily life. Understanding the let them theory intellectually is powerful, but the real transformation happens when it begins changing everyday behavior, reactions, conversations, and decisions. In this chapter, the book shifts from philosophy to practical application, showing how the theory can completely change the way people handle relationships, stress, conflict, rejection, work, family dynamics, and even their own inner thoughts. The author explains that many people agree with the idea of let them while listening to a book or watching a video, but the challenge begins when real emotions appear in real situations. It is easy to say let them in theory. It becomes much harder when someone ignores you, criticizes you, disappoints you, rejects you, or behaves unfairly. This chapter teaches that emotional freedom is built through small daily choices, repeated consistently over time. The first practical lesson in this section is learning to pause before reacting emotionally. Most people live in reaction mode. Someone says something upsetting, and they immediately become defensive. Someone takes longer to reply to a message, and anxiety appears instantly. Someone criticizes them, and they begin mentally arguing or over-explaining themselves. The book teaches that one of the most powerful habits a person can develop is the ability to pause and ask a simple question. Am I trying to control something outside my control right now? That single moment of awareness can completely change how someone responds. Imagine a situation where a friend suddenly becomes distant. In the past, you may have sent multiple messages, overthought the situation, or desperately tried to fix a connection. But applying the let them theory means noticing the urge to chase and choosing a different response. Instead of forcing connection, you allow space. You let them communicate if they want to. You stop making someone else's behavior responsible for your emotional peace. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop abandoning yourself in order to manage another person's choices. The chapter also explains how useful this mindset becomes in family relationships. Many people carry constant stress because they are trying to change family members who refuse to change. A parent may constantly criticize. A sibling may remain irresponsible. A relative may never fully understand your life choices. People often spend years emotionally exhausted because they keep hoping that one more conversation, one more explanation, or one more sacrifice will finally create understanding. But the let them theory teaches that peace often begins when you stop trying to force emotional outcomes. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is accept people as they are while creating healthy emotional boundaries. A relatable hypothetical scenario involves a young woman whose family constantly pressures her to follow a traditional career path, even though she wants to pursue creative work. Every family gathering becomes emotionally draining because she keeps trying to convince everyone to support her dreams. She over-explains her choices, argues repeatedly, and feels emotionally shattered whenever someone doubts her. Eventually, she realizes something life-changing. She does not need universal approval to pursue her own life. She can respect her family while still allowing them to disagree. Let them think differently becomes a source of emotional peace instead of conflict. The chapter strongly emphasizes how the theory applies to social media and modern communication. Today, people are constantly exposed to opinions, comparisons, criticism, and validation. A single comment can affect someone's mood for hours. Many people repeatedly check who viewed their stories, who liked their posts, or who did not respond. The book explains that much of modern stress comes from emotional attachment to digital reactions. Applying the let them theory means learning not to emotionally collapse every time someone online misunderstands, criticizes, ignores, or disagrees with you. Imagine posting something meaningful online that reflects your true personality or beliefs. Some people support it, while others criticize it. The old mindset says, I need everyone to understand me. The let them mindset says, people are allowed to have opinions. This simple shift protects emotional energy and prevents endless overthinking. Instead of wasting hours defending yourself to strangers, you focus on living authentically. Another major area where the theory becomes powerful is conflict. Most arguments become emotionally destructive because both people are trying to control each other's perspective. They want to force understanding, agreement, or validation. But the chapter teaches that not every disagreement needs to become a battle. Sometimes people will misunderstand you despite your best efforts. Sometimes they will interpret your actions incorrectly. Instead of exhausting yourself trying to control their perception, you can calmly communicate your truth and let them respond however they choose. The book also introduces the importance of observing people's actions instead of becoming emotionally attached to potential or promises. Many people stay trapped in unhealthy relationships because they focus on who someone could become rather than who they consistently show themselves to be. Applying the theory means accepting reality more honestly. If someone repeatedly disrespects you, lies to you, ignores your boundaries, or fails to value your effort, stop trying to emotionally negotiate with reality. Let people reveal themselves through consistent behavior instead of forcing yourself to believe temporary words. A particularly powerful example involves workplace stress. Imagine an employee who constantly tries to gain approval from everyone around them. They overwork, avoid saying no, and become emotionally affected by every piece of criticism. Eventually, they become exhausted because their self-worth depends entirely on external validation. Applying the let them theory changes the dynamic completely. They begin understanding that they cannot control every opinion in the workplace. They focus instead on doing meaningful work, maintaining professionalism, and respecting themselves even when criticism appears. The chapter also teaches applying this theory requires emotional discipline because the human mind naturally seeks certainty and control. People want reassurance. They want clarity. They want guarantees that relationships will last, that people will stay loyal, and that they will not be rejected. But life cannot provide perfect certainty. Emotional maturity comes from learning to tolerate uncertainty without losing yourself emotionally. One of the most practical exercises suggested indirectly through this mindset is learning to mentally separate what I can control from what I cannot control. For example, you cannot control other people's opinions, whether someone stays or leaves, how quickly someone replies, whether everyone understands you, whether someone appreciates your effort. But you can control your reactions, your boundaries, your self-respect, your mindset, your choices and actions. This distinction becomes incredibly powerful in daily life because it prevents people from wasting emotional energy on unwinnable battles. The chapter also addresses a fear many people have that letting them means becoming passive or weak. But the book clarifies that emotional freedom is not about tolerating abuse or avoiding responsibility. It is about releasing the unhealthy need to control outcomes. You can still communicate clearly, set boundaries, protect yourself, and walk away from unhealthy situations. The difference is that your peace no longer depends on forcing someone else to behave differently. Reflective questions become especially important in this chapter because daily habits reveal emotional patterns. How much of your stress comes from trying to control how others behave toward you? Which situations trigger your need for reassurance most strongly? Are you spending more energy managing other people's emotions than managing your own? What relationships would improve if you stopped chasing control and focus instead on acceptance and boundaries? The beauty of applying the let them theory daily is that small moments begin creating major emotional shifts. You stop reacting impulsively. You stop chasing people's attention. You stop over-explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. You stop exhausting yourself trying to earn approval from everyone. Slowly, life begins to feel lighter because your emotional state becomes less dependent on external reactions. By the end of this chapter, the listener understands that emotional freedom is not created through one dramatic decision. It is built through repeated daily choices. Every moment you choose acceptance over control, boundaries over desperation, authenticity over approval seeking, and self-respect over emotional chasing, you strengthen your inner peace. And over time, those small choices completely transform the way you experience relationships, stress, and yourself. Main points. The let them theory becomes powerful when applied consistently in everyday situations. Emotional freedom begins by pausing before reacting impulsively. Many daily stresses come from trying to control people, opinions, and outcomes. Acceptance and healthy boundaries are more effective than emotional chasing or over-explaining. Social media and modern communication often increase emotional dependence on validation. Observing actions honestly is healthier than clinging to false hope or potential. Emotional maturity comes from focusing on what you can control instead of obsessing over what you cannot. Reflective questions. Which situations in your daily life trigger the strongest emotional reactions? How often do you over-explain yourself to gain approval or understanding? Are there relationships where you are doing all the emotional work? What would change if you stopped trying to manage everyone's perception of you? In what area of your life do you most need to practice let them? Actionable lessons. Pause before reacting emotionally and ask yourself whether the situation is within your control. Practice allowing people to have their opinions without trying to change them immediately. Focus on observing consistent behavior instead of chasing reassurance. Set boundaries with people who repeatedly damage your peace. Redirect emotional energy toward your own growth, self-respect, and stability instead of constant approval seeking. Lessons about relationships and friendships. One of the most emotional and eye-opening parts of the let them theory focuses on relationships and friendships, because this is where people often experience the deepest attachment, insecurity, disappointment, and emotional pain. Human beings naturally crave connection. They want to feel loved, understood, valued, chosen, and emotionally safe. But the book explains that many relationships become unhealthy not because people stop caring about each other, but because fear, control, unrealistic expectations, and emotional dependence slowly replace genuine connection. This chapter teaches that healthy relationships cannot be built through pressure, chasing, or constant emotional management. Real connection grows when people allow each other freedom while still maintaining self-respect and healthy boundaries. The chapter begins by addressing a painful truth many people avoid. Not every relationship is meant to last forever, and not every friendship will remain the same throughout life. Many people struggle deeply with this reality because they expect emotional permanence. They believe that if a friendship once felt strong, it should always remain exactly the same. They believe that love means someone should never change, drift away, or disappoint them. But life constantly changes people. Priorities evolve. Personalities shift. Emotional needs grow in different directions. The book argues that suffering often begins when people resist this natural reality instead of accepting it. Imagine two close friends who spent years talking every day, sharing secrets, and supporting each other through difficult times. Over time, one friend becomes focused on career growth, new responsibilities, and different social circles. The other friend notices the distance and begins feeling abandoned. Instead of accepting the change, they become emotionally reactive. They overanalyze delayed replies, feel hurt by canceled plans, and constantly try to recreate the old version of the friendship. The chapter explains that this happens in countless relationships. People try to force relationships to remain emotionally frozen in time instead of accepting that change is a natural part of life. The let them theory introduces a healthy approach. If someone's priorities change, let them. If someone naturally becomes more distant, let them show you where they currently stand in your life. This does not mean becoming emotionally cold or pretending the loss does not hurt. It means accepting reality instead of exhausting yourself trying to control another person's emotional availability. One of the strongest lessons in this chapter is understanding the difference between genuine love and emotional attachment. Many people believe love means constantly needing reassurance, attention, and validation from others. But the book explains that relationships built entirely on emotional dependence become unstable because one person's peace depends completely on another person's behavior. Healthy relationships involve closeness without emotional imprisonment. You care deeply, but you do not lose yourself in the process. A powerful hypothetical scenario illustrates this clearly. Imagine someone in a romantic relationship who constantly fears abandonment. Every delayed text message creates anxiety. Every disagreement feels like a threat to the relationship. They repeatedly seek reassurance because they are terrified of being left behind. Over time, this fear leads them to become controlling, emotionally reactive, and overly dependent on their partner's attention. The relationship becomes emotionally exhausting for both people. The chapter explains that many relationships suffer not because love is absent, but because fear is controlling behavior. The book repeatedly emphasizes that you cannot force someone to value you correctly. This is one of the hardest lessons for many people to accept. Some individuals spend years trying to prove their worth to emotionally unavailable partners or one-sided friendships. They give endless time, energy, loyalty, and understanding, hoping the other person will eventually appreciate them fully. But the painful truth is that effort cannot force emotional reciprocity. If someone consistently fails to respect, prioritize, or value the relationship, no amount of overgiving can guarantee change. Think about how many friendships survive only because one person keeps making all the effort. They are always the one initiating conversations, making plans, checking in emotionally, and trying to maintain connection. Meanwhile, the other person contributes very little. The chapter encourages listeners to ask themselves an uncomfortable question. Is this relationship genuinely mutual, or are you carrying it entirely by yourself? Emotional honesty becomes essential because many people continue investing in relationships that are emotionally draining simply because they fear letting go. Another major theme in this chapter is boundaries. The book explains that many people confuse boundaries with rejection or selfishness because they were taught to prioritize everyone else's comfort above their own well-being. As a result, they tolerate disrespect, emotional manipulation, and one-sided dynamics just to avoid conflict. But healthy relationships require boundaries. Without boundaries, resentment slowly builds because one person constantly sacrifices themselves to maintain peace. Imagine someone with a friend who only reaches out when they need emotional support, favors, or help, but disappears whenever the relationship requires mutual effort. The person may continue tolerating this behavior for years because they fear losing the friendship, but internally, they feel emotionally drained and unappreciated. The let them theory teaches that allowing people unlimited access to your energy while receiving little respect in return is not kindness. It is self-abandonment. Emotional maturity means recognizing when a relationship consistently damages your peace and having the courage to protect yourself emotionally. The chapter also explores how expectations create unnecessary suffering in relationships. Many people silently expect others to love them exactly the way they would love others. They expect equal effort, equal emotional awareness, and equal communication styles. But human beings are different. Some people are emotionally expressive while others struggle with vulnerability. Some naturally prioritize relationships while others become consumed by work or personal goals. The book teaches that understanding these differences can reduce unnecessary resentment. However, the chapter carefully balances acceptance with self-respect. Accepting that people are imperfect does not mean tolerating repeated disrespect, dishonesty, or emotional neglect. The let them theory is not about becoming passive. It is about recognizing when chasing, controlling, or over-explaining no longer creates healthy connection. Sometimes the healthiest response is not to fight harder for a relationship, but to step back and let people reveal how much effort they are genuinely willing to give. A relatable example appears in romantic relationships where one partner repeatedly promises change but never follows through consistently. The other person continues hoping that more patience, understanding, or sacrifice will eventually transform the relationship. But the chapter teaches listeners to pay attention to patterns instead of temporary emotional moments. Genuine care is reflected through consistent action, not occasional words during emotional conversations. One of the most freeing ideas in this section is understanding that rejection in relationships does not define personal worth. Many people internalize breakups, distance, or failed friendships as proof that they are unlovable or not enough. But the book explains that compatibility, emotional timing, maturity, and life circumstances all influence relationships. Someone leaving your life does not erase your value as a person. The chapter also encourages listeners to become more intentional about the people they allow into their emotional world. Relationships shape emotional energy, self-esteem, and mental peace more than most people realize. Constant exposure to negativity, criticism, manipulation, or emotional inconsistency can deeply affect confidence and emotional stability. Emotionally healthy people stop chasing relationships simply because they fear loneliness. Instead, they choose connections based on mutual respect, trust, peace, and emotional honesty. Reflective questions become especially important in this chapter. Are there relationships in your life where you constantly feel emotionally drained? Are you trying to earn love and respect that should be given freely? Do you confuse emotional attachment with genuine connection? Are you sacrificing your boundaries to avoid losing people? What would change if you stopped forcing relationships and allowed people to show you their true level of investment naturally? The practical lessons from this chapter are deeply transformative. The next time someone repeatedly shows inconsistency, stop overanalyzing their intentions and observe their actions honestly. The next time you feel desperate to keep a relationship alive, ask yourself whether the connection is mutual or driven by fear of loss. The next time someone disrespects your boundaries, remember that protecting your peace is not selfish. And most importantly, stop measuring your worth by who chooses to stay or leave. By the end of this chapter, the listener begins understanding a powerful truth. Healthy relationships do not require constant emotional chasing. Real connection feels mutual, respectful, and emotionally safe. The more people stop trying to control relationships through fear and desperation, the more space they create for authentic love, meaningful friendships, and emotional peace. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stop forcing connection and allow relationships to reveal their true nature naturally. Main points. Healthy relationships cannot be built through control, chasing, or emotional dependence. Not every friendship or relationship is meant to last forever. Emotional attachment is different from genuine love and connection. You cannot force someone to value, respect, or prioritize you properly. Boundaries are necessary for emotional health and self-respect. Consistent actions matter more than temporary promises or words. Your worth is not defined by who stays or leaves your life. Reflective questions. Are your relationships based on mutual effort or emotional chasing? Which relationships in your life currently drain your emotional energy? Are you tolerating disrespect because you fear losing connection? Do you often confuse attachment and fear of loneliness with love? What boundaries do you need to protect your emotional peace? Actionable lessons. Pay attention to consistent behavior instead of temporary emotional promises. Stop over-investing in one-sided relationships. Practice setting boundaries without guilt. Allow people to show their true level of care through actions. Focus on building relationships that feel peaceful, respectful, and emotionally balanced instead of constantly stressful. Overthinking and anxiety solutions. One of the most exhausting battles many people fight every single day happens entirely inside their own mind. It is the endless replaying of conversations, the constant fear of rejection, the obsessive need to predict outcomes, and the overwhelming anxiety caused by trying to control things that cannot truly be controlled. In the chapter Overthinking and Anxiety Solutions, the Let Them theory explains that overthinking is not simply a bad habit. It is often an emotional survival strategy created by fear, insecurity, uncertainty, and a desperate desire to avoid pain. People overthink because they believe that if they analyze situations long enough, worry deeply enough, or prepare for every possible outcome, they can somehow protect themselves from rejection, disappointment, embarrassment, or loss. But instead of creating safety, overthinking slowly traps them in emotional exhaustion. The chapter begins by exposing how deceptive overthinking can be. Many people mistake it for responsibility or intelligence. They tell themselves they are just trying to understand the situation or thinking ahead. But in reality, overthinking often becomes mental self-torture. A simple text message can trigger hours of anxiety. A small mistake can become an all-night mental replay. A single uncertain situation can dominate someone's thoughts for days. The book explains that overthinking is often the mind's attempt to gain certainty in a world where certainty does not exist. Imagine this common scenario. You send an important message to someone you care about, and hours pass without a response. At first, it feels minor, but slowly, your mind begins creating stories. Did I say something wrong? Are they upset with me? Are they losing interest? Should I send another message? Soon, one unanswered text begins affecting your mood, focus, and confidence. The person may simply be busy, distracted, or emotionally tired, but your mind turns uncertainty into emotional danger. The chapter explains that this pattern happens constantly because people try to control situations mentally when they cannot control them externally. The Let Them theory introduces a powerful solution that sounds simple but changes everything. Let people respond how they respond. Let situations unfold without obsessively trying to manage every possible outcome. This mindset interrupts the cycle of overthinking because it removes the illusion that endless mental analysis can guarantee emotional safety. One of the strongest ideas in this chapter is that anxiety often grows from resistance to uncertainty. Human beings naturally want clarity. They want reassurance that relationships are stable, that people approve of them, that plans will work out, and that painful outcomes can be avoided. But life rarely provides complete certainty. Relationships change. People disappoint each other. Plans fail. Misunderstandings happen. The more someone tries to mentally control uncertainty, the more anxious they become. A relatable example appears in workplace situations. Imagine an employee who receives a short email from their manager asking for a meeting tomorrow. Instantly, anxiety appears. Instead of waiting calmly, the employee spends the entire evening imagining worst-case scenarios. Am I getting fired? Did I make a mistake? What if I disappointed them? Their body reacts emotionally to imagined events that have not even happened. By the next day, they are mentally exhausted from fighting imaginary problems. The chapter explains that overthinking often creates suffering long before reality does. The book also explores how anxiety becomes connected to people-pleasing and fear of judgment. Many individuals constantly monitor how others perceive them. After social interactions, they replay conversations repeatedly. Did I sound awkward? Should I have said something differently? Do they think negatively about me now? The mind searches for reassurance but rarely finds peace because there's always another possible interpretation to fear. The Let Them theory teaches that much of this suffering comes from trying to control other people's thoughts. People want to manage how they are perceived because they believe judgment threatens their emotional safety. But the chapter reminds listeners that they cannot fully control what others think. Even if they explain themselves perfectly, some people will still misunderstand them. Once this truth is accepted, enormous mental energy becomes available again. A hypothetical scenario in this chapter illustrates this perfectly. Imagine a young woman who wants to start posting educational videos online. She spends months planning, rewriting scripts, and overanalyzing every detail. But the real reason she delays posting is not perfectionism. It is fear of judgment. She imagines strangers criticizing her appearance, intelligence, or voice. Her anxiety becomes so intense that she never begins. Years later, she realizes that overthinking did not protect her from failure. It protected her from growth. The chapter emphasizes that many people mistake overthinking for preparation when it is actually avoidance driven by fear. Another major lesson in this section is that anxiety often increases when people confuse thoughts with reality. Just because the mind imagines rejection does not mean rejection is happening. Just because the brain creates a worst-case scenario does not mean it will occur. The human mind constantly generates stories, predictions, and fears, especially during uncertainty. Emotional maturity involves learning not to believe every anxious thought automatically. The chapter introduces the importance of grounding attention in the present moment. Overthinking usually lives in the future or the past. People either replay previous mistakes endlessly or imagine future disasters repeatedly. Rarely are they mentally present in the current moment. The book explains that peace becomes possible when people stop mentally time-traveling into imagined catastrophes and return attention to what is actually happening right now. Think about how many hours people lose worrying about situations that never happen. Someone fears rejection before applying for a job, only to succeed later. Someone spends days worrying about a difficult conversation that ends up being peaceful. Someone imagines embarrassment before attending an event, only to realize nobody was paying as much attention to them as they feared. Anxiety often exaggerates danger far beyond reality. The chapter also teaches listeners to separate what they can control from what they cannot. This becomes one of the most effective solutions for anxiety. For example, you cannot control whether someone likes you, whether everyone approves of your decisions, whether life always goes according to plan, whether people misunderstand you, whether rejection happens. But you can control your effort, your honesty, your boundaries, your mindset, your reactions, your willingness to keep moving forward despite uncertainty. This distinction creates emotional stability because it redirects energy away from impossible control and toward personal responsibility. Another practical lesson involves reducing the habit of emotional chasing. Many people increase their anxiety by constantly seeking reassurance. They repeatedly ask if someone is upset, check messages obsessively, monitor social media activity, or mentally search for hidden meaning in every interaction. But reassurance rarely solves anxiety permanently because the mind quickly creates new fears again. The chapter teaches that lasting peace comes not from controlling uncertainty, but from becoming emotionally capable of handling uncertainty. The book also highlights a connection between self-worth and anxiety. People who rely heavily on external validation become extremely vulnerable to overthinking because every interaction feels emotionally dangerous. A delayed reply feels like rejection. Criticism feels like personal failure. Disagreement feels threatening. But when self-worth becomes more internal, anxiety loses much of its power because external reactions no longer completely define emotional stability. Reflective questions play an important role in this chapter. How much of your stress comes from situations that only exist in your mind? Are you trying to solve uncertainty through endless mental analysis? What fears repeatedly dominate your thoughts? How often do you seek reassurance instead of building self-trust? What opportunities have you delayed because overthinking convinced you something might go wrong? The practical application of this chapter is deeply transformative. The next time your mind begins spiraling, pause and ask yourself, am I reacting to reality or to a story my mind created? The next time uncertainty appears, resist the urge to mentally solve every possible outcome immediately. The next time someone's behavior triggers anxiety, remind yourself that you cannot control another person's thoughts or actions. Focus instead on your own peace, boundaries, and emotional balance. By the end of this chapter, the listener understands a powerful truth. Overthinking does not create control. It creates exhaustion. Anxiety grows stronger when people try to mentally manage every uncertainty in life. But emotional freedom becomes possible when they accept uncertainty, trust themselves more deeply, and stop giving every fearful thought complete authority. The moment people stop fighting imaginary battles inside their minds, they finally begin experiencing the peace they were searching for all along. Main points. Overthinking is often driven by fear, insecurity, and a desire for certainty. Anxiety grows when people try to mentally control uncertain situations. Many fears exist only inside the mind and never become reality. Seeking constant reassurance usually increases anxiety instead of solving it. Emotional freedom comes from accepting uncertainty instead of resisting it. You cannot control other people's thoughts, reactions, or opinions. Peace comes from focusing on what you can control rather than obsessing over what you cannot. Reflective questions. What situations trigger your overthinking most often? How much of your anxiety comes from imagined scenarios instead of actual reality? Are you seeking reassurance because you do not fully trust yourself emotionally? What opportunities or experiences have you avoided because of fear and overanalysis? What would change if you accepted uncertainty instead of constantly fighting it? Actionable lessons. Pause when anxious thoughts appear and ask whether they are based on facts or assumptions. Stop replaying conversations and try and control other people's opinions mentally. Practice focusing on the present moment instead of imagined future disasters. Build self-trust instead of depending on constant reassurance from others. Remind yourself daily that uncertainty is a normal part of life, not a personal threat. Main actionable lessons. After exploring the emotional struggles caused by overthinking, people-pleasing, fear of judgment, unhealthy attachment, and the desperate need to control others, the let them theory ultimately brings a listener to its most important question: how do you actually live differently after understanding all of this? Knowledge alone does not transform a person. Someone can understand every psychological concept in the world and still repeat the same emotional patterns every day. Real transformation happens through consistent action. In this final section, the book focuses on practical lessons that people can apply immediately in daily life to create more peace, confidence, emotional freedom, and self-respect. The first and most important actionable lesson is learning to separate what you can control from what you cannot. This idea sounds simple, but most people ignore it constantly. They waste emotional energy trying to manage other people's feelings, opinions, reactions, choices, and behaviors. They obsess over why someone changed, why someone ignored them, why someone misunderstood them, or why someone failed to appreciate them. The book teaches that one of the fastest ways to destroy your peace is to become emotionally attached to things outside your control. The healthy approach is to redirect focus toward your own mindset, boundaries, decisions, and reactions. Imagine someone spending hours worrying because a friend has become emotionally distant. They repeatedly check their phone, replay conversations, and mentally search for ways to fix the relationship. But the more they obsess, the more anxious and emotionally exhausted they become. The let them theory teaches that instead of chasing certainty or control, they should pause and ask themselves, can I control another person's emotional availability? The answer is no, but they can control whether they continue abandoning their own peace trying to force connection. Another major lesson in this chapter is the importance of accepting reality instead of fighting it emotionally. Many people suffer because they refuse to accept what people's actions are clearly showing them. They cling to potential instead of reality. They continue hoping toxic relationships will suddenly become healthy. They keep waiting for emotionally unavailable people to become consistent. They repeatedly excuse disrespect because they fear loss more than unhappiness. The book teaches that emotional maturity begins when people stop negotiating with reality and start seeing situations honestly. A relatable example appears in romantic relationships. Imagine someone whose partner repeatedly cancels plans, avoids emotional conversations, and puts minimal effort into the relationship. Instead of accepting the situation, they constantly search for explanations. Maybe they are just stressed. Maybe things will improve soon. Maybe if I try harder, everything will change. Years can pass in emotional confusion because the person is attached to hope rather than reality. The actionable lesson here is simple but powerful. Believe patterns, not temporary promises. Observe consistent behavior honestly instead of forcing yourself to ignore what is happening in front of you. The book also strongly emphasizes the importance of boundaries. Many people believe boundaries are selfish because they were conditioned to prioritize other people's comfort above their own emotional health. They say yes when they want to say no. They tolerate disrespect to avoid conflict. They overextend themselves emotionally because they fear disappointing others. Over time, this creates resentment, exhaustion, and emotional burnout. The let them theory teaches that boundaries are not punishments. Boundaries are acts of self-respect. Imagine someone with a friend who only contacts them when they need help, but disappears during important moments. The person continues giving emotional support because they fear losing the friendship, even though the relationship feels deeply one-sided. Applying the theory means recognizing that protecting your emotional energy is not cruelty. It means understanding that relationships should involve mutual care, not constant emotional sacrifice from one side. Another actionable lesson involves learning to stop over-explaining yourself. Many people become emotionally trapped trying to make everyone understand their intentions, choices, and feelings perfectly. They fear being misunderstood so deeply that they spend enormous energy defending themselves constantly. But the book teaches a liberating truth. Not everyone will understand you, and not everyone has to. Some people are committed to misunderstanding because they view life through their own insecurities, assumptions, and perspectives. Endless explanation rarely changes those people. Sometimes peace comes from calmly expressing your truth once and allowing others to think whatever they want. A hypothetical example in this section perfectly captures this idea. Imagine a young man who decides to leave a stable career to pursue creative work. His family criticizes a decision and constantly questions his judgment. At first, he spends months trying to justify every detail of his choice. He explains his plans repeatedly, hoping for approval. But eventually he realizes something important. No explanation will fully remove their fear or skepticism. The actionable lesson becomes clear. Instead of emotionally exhausting himself chasing approval, he can respectfully allow others to disagree while continuing to build a life that feels authentic to him. The chapter also teaches listeners to stop personalizing everything. One of the biggest causes of emotional suffering is assuming that every negative interaction is a reflection of personal worth. Someone gives a short reply, and people assume they are disliked. Someone seems distracted, and they immediately fear rejection. But often, other people's behavior has little to do with you. People carry their own stress, fears, emotional struggles, insecurities, and distractions. Emotional freedom grows when individuals stop making themselves the center of every negative interpretation. The let them theory also encourages people to become more comfortable with uncertainty. Many individuals constantly seek reassurance because they want emotional guarantees. They want certainty that relationships will last, that people will stay loyal, and that life will go according to plan. But life cannot provide perfect certainty. The more people try to eliminate uncertainty completely, the more anxious they become. The actionable lesson here is learning to tolerate discomfort without immediately trying to control everything around you. Another practical lesson involves paying attention to emotional triggers. Whenever strong emotional reactions appear, the book encourages listeners to ask deeper questions. Why does this situation affect me so strongly? Am I afraid of rejection, abandonment, or judgment? Am I trying to control something outside my power? These moments become opportunities for self-awareness instead of automatic emotional reactions. The chapter also explains that self-respect must become stronger than the fear of losing people. Many individuals stay trapped in unhealthy situations because they believe losing connection would be unbearable. They tolerate disrespect, inconsistency, and emotional neglect because they fear loneliness. But the book argues that abandoning yourself to keep others close creates even deeper suffering. Real confidence grows when people trust that they can survive disappointment, rejection, and change without losing their identity. A powerful real-life example involves social media and public opinion. Imagine someone who wants to share their ideas online, but constantly fears criticism. They spend months editing content, deleting posts, and hiding parts of themselves because they want everyone to approve. Eventually, they realize something freeing. Criticism is unavoidable. No matter what they create, someone will dislike it. The actionable lesson becomes obvious. Instead of trying to avoid all judgment, focus on creating honestly and authentically. The chapter repeatedly reminds listeners that small daily choices create emotional transformation. Emotional freedom is not achieved through one dramatic moment. It is built every time you choose self-respect over people-pleasing, acceptance over control, boundaries over emotional chasing, and authenticity over approval-seeking. These small choices gradually rebuild confidence and inner peace. Reflective questions become essential in this section. What situations are currently draining your emotional energy because you are trying to control them? Are there people in your life whose approval still determines your self-worth? What boundaries do you keep avoiding because you fear disappointing others? Which emotional patterns continue repeating because you refuse to accept reality honestly? What would your life feel like if you trusted yourself more than external validation? By the end of this chapter, the listener understands that the let them theory is not just a mindset. It is a daily practice of emotional responsibility and self-respect. It teaches people to stop fighting reality, stop chasing control, and stop sacrificing themselves for approval. Instead, they begin building a calmer, more grounded life where peace comes from within rather than from constantly managing everyone around them. And that shift has the power to completely transform how a person experiences relationships, anxiety, confidence, and life itself. Main points. Focus on controlling your own actions, mindset, and boundaries instead of controlling others. Accept reality honestly instead of clinging to false hope or potential. Boundaries are acts of self-respect, not selfishness. Stop over-explaining yourself to people determined to misunderstand you. Other people's behavior is often more about them than about you. Emotional freedom requires accepting uncertainty instead of trying to eliminate it completely. Small daily choices create long-term emotional transformation. Reflective questions. What situations in your life are emotionally exhausting because you keep trying to control them? Which relationships currently require stronger boundaries? Are you seeking approval more than authenticity? What truths about your life or relationships are you avoiding accepting honestly? What would change if your self-worth no longer depended on other people's validation? Actionable lessons. Practice asking yourself what is truly within your control during stressful situations. Observe people's consistent behavior instead of only listening to promises. Set boundaries even when it feels uncomfortable at first. Stop seeking universal approval because it is impossible. Build emotional peace through self-respect, honesty, and acceptance instead of emotional chasing and overthinking. Final thoughts. As the let them theory reaches a conclusion, the book leaves the listener with one of the most powerful realizations of all. Most of the suffering people experience in life does not come from other people alone, but from the exhausting struggle to control them, change them, impress them, keep them, or gain approval from them. For years, many individuals live as emotional prisoners without even realizing it. Their happiness rises and falls depending on who texts them back, who supports them, who understands them, who stays loyal, and who validates their choices. They spend enormous amounts of mental and emotional energy trying to manage other people's opinions, reactions, moods, and behavior. But the core message of this book is deeply freeing. Peace begins when you stop trying to control what was never yours to control in the first place. The final chapter reflects on how much life changes when a person truly embraces the words "let them." Let them judge you. Let them misunderstand you. Let them leave. Let them disagree. Let them doubt you. Let them think differently. Let them reveal who they truly are through their actions. These two simple words sound small, but they carry enormous emotional power because they shift attention away from controlling others and back toward protecting your own peace, self-respect, and emotional freedom. The book explains that many people spend their entire lives waiting for permission to finally be themselves. They wait for approval from parents before pursuing dreams. They wait for validation from partners before feeling worthy. They wait for society to accept them before expressing their true personality. They constantly shape their lives around avoiding rejection and criticism. But in doing so, they slowly disconnect from themselves. The let them theory teaches that freedom begins when people stop organizing their lives around other people's comfort and begin living more honestly. Imagine someone who always wanted to start a business, create content online, pursue art, or change careers, but spent years avoiding action because they feared judgment. Every time they thought about starting, they imagined criticism, failure, and embarrassment, so they stayed silent and safe. But eventually, they realized something life-changing. No matter what they do, someone will always criticize them anyway. At that moment, fear begins losing its control. Instead of wasting years trying to avoid judgment, they finally begin living authentically. The chapter explains that this shift is where real confidence is born. One of the most emotional ideas in this final section is the understanding that people's behavior often reveals more about them than about you. Someone rejecting you does not automatically mean you are unworthy. Someone misunderstanding you does not erase your truth. Someone leaving your life does not destroy your value. Human beings carry their own fears, insecurities, emotional wounds, perspectives, and limitations into every interaction. Yet many people personalize everything, believing every disappointment is proof they are not enough. The book challenges this mindset directly and encourages listeners to stop measuring their worth through external validation. The chapter also reflects on how much emotional suffering comes from resisting reality. People hold on to relationships long after they become unhealthy. They keep chasing emotionally unavailable people. They over-explain themselves to those committed to misunderstanding them. They replay painful situations endlessly, hoping to mentally change outcomes that already happened. But reality does not become easier because people refuse to accept it. In fact, suffering often increases when individuals continue fighting what is already true. A relatable example appears in friendships. Imagine someone noticing that a close friendship has slowly become one-sided. They are always the one reaching out, making plans, and maintaining emotional connection. Deep down, they know the relationship has changed, but they continue exhausting themselves trying to recreate the past. The let them theory teaches that sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is stop forcing connection and allow people to show you where they truly stand. This may feel painful initially, but it also creates clarity, dignity, and emotional peace. Another important reflection in this chapter is the idea that emotional freedom is not about becoming cold, detached, or uncaring. The goal is not to stop loving people or stop caring about relationships. The goal is to stop losing yourself in the process. Emotionally healthy people still experience love, disappointment, grief, rejection, and sadness. The difference is that they no longer allow external situations to completely control their identity or self-worth. They learn to care deeply while still remaining grounded within themselves. The book also emphasizes that acceptance is different from weakness. Many people misunderstand acceptance because they think it means tolerating mistreatment or giving up entirely. But acceptance simply means seeing reality clearly instead of constantly fighting it emotionally. You can accept that someone is unhealthy for you and still walk away. You can accept that someone misunderstands you and still speak your truth calmly. You can accept that not everyone will support your dreams and still continue pursuing them confidently. A powerful hypothetical scenario illustrates this beautifully. Imagine two people experiencing rejection after applying for an important opportunity. The first person interprets the rejection as proof they are not talented or worthy. They become emotionally crushed and stop trying altogether. The second person feels disappointed but accepts that rejection is part of life. Instead of allowing one outcome to define their identity, they continue moving forward. Both people experience the same event, but their internal responses created completely different futures. The chapter explains that emotional resilience is built not by avoiding pain, but by learning not to lose yourself within it. The final section also reminds listeners that life becomes lighter when people stop trying to carry responsibilities that were never theirs. You are not responsible for making everyone understand you. You are not responsible for managing everyone's emotions. You are not responsible for fixing people who refuse to grow. You are not responsible for earning love through self-sacrifice. Once people release these emotional burdens, they often experience an incredible sense of relief and peace. Another deeply meaningful lesson in this conclusion is that authenticity attracts healthier relationships. When people stop performing for approval and start living more honestly, some relationships naturally fall away. But at the same time, more genuine connections begin appearing because people are finally showing their real selves instead of constantly hiding behind fear and people-pleasing. The book explains that authenticity may cost temporary approval, but it creates long-term emotional freedom. The chapter encourages listeners to reflect deeply on their own lives. How much energy have you spent trying to control things outside your power? How often have you abandoned your own peace trying to gain approval or prevent rejection? Which relationships in your life are based on fear instead of mutual respect? What dreams have you delayed because you were waiting for everyone else's permission? And perhaps the most important question of all, what would your life look like if you truly believed your worth did not depend on other people's opinions? One of the final practical lessons from this book is learning to pause during emotionally difficult moments and quietly remind yourself, let them react however they choose. Let them misunderstand. Let them disagree. Let them leave if they want to. And while they do that, focus on protecting your own peace, integrity, boundaries, and emotional stability. This simple mental shift can prevent countless hours of overthinking, anxiety, emotional chasing, and self-doubt. By the end of the let them theory, the listener realizes that emotional freedom is not found by controlling the world around them. It is found by releasing the unhealthy need to control everything and everyone in the first place. The people who experience the greatest peace are not those with perfect lives or perfect relationships. They are the ones who stop making their inner peace dependent on external approval and external certainty. They trust themselves more deeply. They accept reality more honestly. They stop chasing what does not want to stay. And they finally begin living with more authenticity, self-respect, courage, and calmness. The true power of this book lies in its simplicity. Two words can completely change the way a person experiences life. Let them. Because sometimes the greatest freedom comes not from forcing life to go your way, but from learning to remain peaceful even when it does not. Main points. Most emotional suffering comes from trying to control other people in external situations. Emotional freedom begins when you stop attaching your worth to approval and validation. Acceptance creates peace, while resistance to reality creates suffering. Healthy relationships require authenticity, boundaries, and mutual effort. Rejection, criticism, and misunderstandings do not define your value. Emotional resilience comes from remaining grounded during uncertainty and disappointment. The let them mindset helps people reclaim peace, confidence, and self-respect. Reflective questions. What areas of your life are emotionally exhausting because you are trying to control them? Which relationships require more acceptance or stronger boundaries? How often do you sacrifice authenticity for approval? What fears are preventing you from fully being yourself? What would change if you truly believed your worth was independent of other people's opinions? Actionable lessons. Practice reminding yourself let them during stressful emotional situations. Stop chasing validation from people unwilling to give genuine respect or understanding. Focus on protecting your peace instead of controlling external outcomes. Accept people's actions as information instead of constantly searching for hidden meanings. Build a life based on authenticity, self-respect, and emotional freedom rather than fear and approval seeking. And that's a powerful message behind the let them theory. This book teaches us that true peace begins when we stop trying to control other people's opinions, choices, reactions, and behavior. Whether it's fear of judgment, overthinking, unhealthy relationships, or the constant need for approval, the solution often comes down to two simple words. Let them. Let people think what they want. Let them leave if they choose to. Let them misunderstand you. And while they do that, focus on protecting your own peace, self-respect, emotional freedom, and authentic happiness. If you learned something valuable from this audiobook summary, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Visual Books, and turn on notifications so you never miss future life-changing book summaries. And most importantly, ask yourself this question after today's video. What would your life look like if you stopped giving other people control over your peace? Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next audiobook summary.